to now hand over to James Turnbull from DEFRA, who is going to talk about public procurement and the new buyer standards that are being developed as we speak. Over to you, James.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Turnbull. I work in DEFRA. That's a rather stark-looking slide I produced. It's not as polished as Rufus is there. So I head up the public sector food procurement team within DEFRA. I'm going to talk about what we mean when we talk about public sector food procurement, a bit on the current standards, and then talk about how, in going forward, we're looking at making the food and catering services more sustainable in the public sector, and what the impact of that is for the supply chain as well. Okay, so a little bit of background to what we mean by public sector food procurement. So public sector covers a very wide range of organisations. So everything from canteens in government departments through to patients and staff in the NHS, the prison service and the armed forces, and also education, which is, as the chart shows, between further and higher education school meals, that makes up the majority of spend on public sector food. And annual spend is roughly 2.4 billion as well. So it's just a sense of the scale of it. In terms of the drivers behind our policy and why we're doing what we're doing, so the government has a number of manifesto commitments. One is to encourage the public sector to buy British or procure British. So that's about getting more local and sustainable food into the public sector, into hospitals, schools, etc. And secondly, to increase the number of small and medium enterprises accessing the public sector, accessing public sector contracts. So currently the market is predominantly made up by a smaller number of large wholesalers, and we're looking at ways to get more SMEs supplying into the public sector, either directly or through wholesale sector as well. And that's probably a topic of discussion in its own right. And then we've also had a number of other things happen recently, which you may have seen. So we had a Minister Prentice, who's the food minister at DEFRA. She was in front of a parliamentary committee earlier last year, being questioned about how we supply food within the public sector, and they made a number of recommendations for improvements. And Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy, which was produced in two parts. The second part came out last summer, and that made a number of recommendations again for public sector food, which were around getting more local and smaller companies into the supply chain, healthier food, etc. And we've got most pertinent for this discussion, we've got government's net zero commitments. So set out in a number of places, but primarily the government's net zero strategy, which is Build Back Greener, and that looks at a wide range of measures to achieving net zero by 2050, and that includes through the government's own procurement processes as well. And then we've got an upcoming food strategy white paper, which is a sort of response to Henry Dimbleby's independent report, and that's the government response, which is due shortly as well, and is looking holistically at the whole of the food chain and how we can make improvements, not just sustainability, but across a wide range of factors as well. Okay, just go on to the next slide. My internet is a little bit slow when I click on it before going through. I'll start talking about the next slide, and then hopefully I'll manage to get it to come up shortly. Here we are. Okay, so a little bit on the current policy. Currently, if you want to supply the public sector with food, you have to meet two documents, one called the Government Buying Standards for Food Catering Services, GBSF, and the second one called the Balance Scorecard. In terms of the GBSF, that sets out the standards by which the public sector procure food. So it's looking at all the good things we want, like high animal welfare, reductions in waste, sustainability, etc., and kind of across the whole range of both the food which is procured, but also the catering service themselves. So kind of the operations within the kitchen as well, and the efficiency of the kitchen machinery and all those types of things. So it's quite broad set of standards. The Balance Scorecard sets out a methodology for ensuring that all those good things we want are taken into account, and that cost isn't the only driver behind the procurement within the public sector. Obviously, well-known budgets are tight, and that's a challenge. So cost is a key driver, and our work is really to make sure that cost isn't the only factor, and there's lots of things taken into account. So that's the current policy. Looking, I've clicked too far. Looking forward, hopefully the slides will go back in a second.
James, you can also use your keyboard to go back. Yeah, there you are.
Oh, okay, great, thank you. I think that might be my problem. I think I was pressing both and it was making it move. Thank you. So the vision for the updated policy. So we've currently got those two policy documents that are quite broad, quite long, and what we want to do is kind of condense them down, make them easier. Particularly, we recognise that for smaller businesses, reading lengthy government procurement documents is not how you wanted to spend your time. Even if we recognise you're very busy as well, so even if you had the time, it's probably not what you want to be reading. So we're looking at how we can streamline the process as much as possible. And going forward, healthier, sustainable food is certainly high on the agenda, and we're looking at 4 areas, which I'll come on to in a bit more detail, but they are fair and transparent procurement. So this is about how we bring in things around net zero, ethical trading, modern slavery, which is an issue in the food supply chain as well. And then moving across to the top, looking at healthier, more sustainable menu choices. So this is all about the actual menu cycles and encouraging the public sector to procure seasonal, local produce, take account of vegetarian, vegan options, and those kind of things as well, which all move towards more sustainable practices. And then along the bottom, we've got food sourcing. So it's looking at production standards, and I'll come on to this in a second on the next slide. And sustainable catering services, again, I touched on there as well. Oh, the slides are taking on a life of their own. So just going on to a little bit more detail on a couple of these areas and how they impact on sustainability and things I'm thinking about. So I mentioned the new fair, transparent procurement guidance. So that part of that is a requirement which on suppliers to the government food and catering services to have a net zero plan in place. That would be on behalf of the actual supplier. Would need a plan in place for that. Something we want to consider putting in as a requirement going forward. We want sustainable food products to be high on the agenda. So we know that the production method for food is the main cause of greenhouse gas emissions. Transport is actually a very sort of low percentage. I think about 6% of the emissions is transport related. The majority is on the production method. So we are looking to consult on new standards, part of which will be things around tightening up standards around soy products and coffee and palm oil, making sure that they're demonstrably legal and sustainable where they are used. Similar on fisheries, we currently have a standard around fisheries being MSC certified, but I think we're looking at ways to tighten those standards up, and also requiring vegetarian and vegan options as well on menus, so kind of planet healthy menu options. The catering services is more around there's things there on single-use plastic, but certainly around waste, which was something Rufus touched on as well. So food waste, major cause of emissions. So we are looking at ways of measuring waste within the public sector and tightening up the standards again there. And then this is all underpinned by the need to actually collate data on the environmental impacts across the public sector, so that we can be held to account as governments on how well we're doing in terms of meeting environmental outcomes. Just going on to the next slide, hopefully it'll go forward. Okay, so I've set out some of the changes we are looking to make there, and this is kind of the timelines we're working to. So we've got our current standards in place, the GBSF and balanced scorecard. We are looking early this year. We're already in early this year, so it'll be soon. We're looking to go to consultation to update the standards, hopefully putting in place many of the things I've outlined there. But the good thing about public consultation is anybody can put in their views and on what the standards should be, and then we'll go through a process of reviewing the consultation and then producing the updated standards in the summer, at which point I will probably be able to talk with more certainty about what the new standards are, because at the minute they're all just proposals which will need to go through consultation as well. And that was, so it goes to the next slide. That was everything I had. So happy to, I can see a few questions in the chat, but happy to take any questions.
Thank you, James. So yes, two questions in the chat box. One from Linda, who says, well, do we need to do more lobbying with the government to insist that the public sector buys British? And I would like to add, maybe not just with central government, but how do we approach our local governments and put that topic on the table? What is your advice there?
Yeah, it's a question we are certainly lobbied on quite a lot already. So to procure British is interesting because so we're part of the World Trade Organization. I'll try and keep this answer fairly brief. As part of the World Trade Organization, countries aren't allowed to have preferential treatment for their own produce. So we can't specify that the public sector must procure British because it's potentially protectionist, in the same way that any other country of the WTO can't favour their own produce over that from the UK. What we can do, though, is talk about the high quality of British food. So, we've got some of the highest animal welfare standards in the world, and we've got obviously very good sustainability credentials compared to a lot of other countries. So within our new standards, we'll really be bringing out all those elements which give a kind of natural kind of preference towards British produce in a lot of cases, but we can't explicitly mandate procurement of British food for WTO reasons.
Thank you. Should we be part of the WTO? That's maybe a question for another time. But there is a question from Team Haywards, who said, I have tried to look into government contracts and tried to contact people, but had no replies, guidance or advice. So where do people go to learn more about these contracts? Is there a website, a specific person within DEFRA that people can talk to, or a specific person within our local authorities?
Yeah, so that's timely. So we've just produced a guidance document, which perhaps I can send on, and I don't know, Flo, if you're happy to circulate afterwards, but we've just produced a guidance document which sets out routes into the public sector, particularly for SMEs. So there's links on there to the main ways to find contracts and to supply the public sector. So hopefully that would cover give a number of different routes in. I mean, essentially, there's kind of a couple of routes to supply in the public sector. One is to speak to the local council procurement officer or the procuring authority within the local hospital about supplying directly, and the other way is to go through a wholesaler and supply a wholesaler who then supplies the government. But the guidance document sets that all out a lot more clearly than I just have there. So perhaps if I circulate that afterwards, that will cover that.
That would be great, James. Thank you very much. Romney Marsh says concerns regarding overall food shortages due to the impact of war from Russia, huge fuel issues and fertilizer issues, as well as shortage of grain globally. How is this going to impact the overall government goals?
Yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? So I think there's a couple of elements. There's certainly short to medium term impacts from Ukraine and oil, etc. And then I think there's the longer term picture. So looking at something like the net zero strategy, that's looking at 2050, and DEFRA's environmental plan is 25 years. So I guess there's the short term time horizons and the major impacts for a lot of sectors and costs, etc. in the short term, and the need for support for those things. But then a longer time horizon where hopefully things level out a bit, and we're looking at those kind of longer term objectives. Not sure if that quite covered it, but
it is a big question. Just from my side, I would be really keen to understand how can these new standards, if you will, that are being developed now be enforced? Is there and how are they monitored? So is there monitoring mechanisms in place? Is there an enforcement mechanism in place, or is it just relying on bodies' goodwill to act in that way?
Yeah, so the standards are mandatory within the majority of the public sector, and so there are contractual requirements. So if it was a contract with a hospital and suppliers failed to meet the requirements, then it would be sort of contractually enforced that way. So they're not just guidance. There is a sort of enforcement behind it. The data point is a good one. We historically haven't had a lot of data on public sector food procurement, and that's something in the consultation we want to increase our access to data. There's a balance there, because we know that if we ask companies to provide additional data, then that's a burden. So I think it's getting that balance of essential information, which allows us to monitor the standards whilst not overburdening the industry, particularly at this point in time.
So will we go to a situation where public bodies will need to show that they are procuring from a number of SMEs, or how far off are we from that? Yeah, so that's certainly what we want. That's what I would like to see, and depending on the consultation responses, is the route we'll hopefully go down in terms of government departments reporting on number of SMEs, reporting on the emissions from the food that they procure, looking at the number of local firms, and the impact on the local economy as well. So sort of social value impacts of procuring locally as well. So yeah, certainly want to go down that route. We'll only slightly hesitant because it's all subject to consultation. Of course. And is there any way the people in the room today can still be part of that consultation process? Yes. Yeah. So as soon as the consultation goes live, I am happy to circulate a link to the consultation. I guess probably via yourself, and people can then
respond to the consultation. If you've not responded to consultation before, that's pretty much how it sounds. But it's a long questionnaire with a copy of the standards, and then you can feed in your views. And alongside that, we'll also do a series of workshops. And again, people are welcome to attend those, which are a more qualitative way of kind of gathering views as well during the process. And they'll run over the summer, the spring, summer time.
Fantastic. Yes, please do share with us any information that you have on how to join this process. That'd be very much appreciated.